So look, the president is the commander-in-chief, whether you like it or not. The president is the commander-in-chief, whether you like it or not. And Congress gets to organize, arm, and discipline the National Guard, whereas the states get to pick the officers and train the militia. So really, Congress gets the bulk of the power when it comes to the National Guards. They get to organize the National Guards, they get to arm the National Guards, and discipline the National Guard. But the governors get to train the National Guard and appoint the officers. This is Federalist Paper 29, and the other one was 46. I don't know. There's two Federalist Papers. So if you're like, hey, what are the laws when it comes to the National Guard or the Army, and then who's got the jurisdiction? The Congress, the Constitution, and the Federalist Papers would be your two main sources. In order to look at the laws, you look to the instrument. That's Ogden v. Gibbons. So the president is the commander-in-chief of American forces, but Gavin Newsom is the commander-in-chief of California's forces. The orders have to be issued through the governor. That's Title 10. Title 10, 12,406. So whereas the president gets to organize and say, all right, Army, let's do this thing, the orders have to go through the governor. Through the governor. So that means the president can't just say, hey, governor, do as I tell you. The governor gets to do what he wants with the National Guard. Charles Breyer said that he was troubled by the president's lawyers, Brett Shumate in particular, his assertion that peaceful protest, a core civil liberty protected by the First Amendment, can justify the invasion of the federal government's troops by calling a protest a rebellion. There's a difference between a protest and a rebellion, is there not? Sure, a protest could break out into something more, or it could just be a protest. It could just be a bunch of peaceful people wearing t-shirts, wearing a hat, blowing bubbles. Gavin Newsom said that there was no invasion, there was no rebellion. It's absurd that the federal government would federalize the National Guard. There is no invasion, and there's no rebellion. What the fuck's the matter with you? Come on, Donald, what the fuck is the matter with you? There's no invasion, there's no rebellion. So Gavin Newsom says that it's absurd that he could federalize the National Guard. The unrest in LA began when the president had invaded Home Depot and 3 other businesses because they had hired undocumented workers. Charles Breyer was appointed by Bill Clinton. Rob Bonta said that the presidential invasion is what caused the chaos and that they should be stopped immediately. Pete Hegseth says he always looks at the court's decisions, but Pete Hegseth, he doesn't respect district court judges when it comes to foreign policy and national security. Anybody want to take a look at Rafiki? Here's Rafiki. Oh, look at Rafiki. Hi there, Rafiki. Now, Rafiki is Matilda's and MODOK's. MODOK is the father. MODOK is the father of Rafiki. And Matilda is the mother. He's got 4 siblings. Oh, no. He's got 3 siblings. He's got 3 siblings. Evelina Landova, Simba, and who else? Lipa Raddick. So let's just say hi to Rafiki for a second. He was Baby Shay in the beginning because he was the runt, so I was worried whether or not he was going to survive. And then I've been kicking out the idea of the Baba Yaga. Do you want to be the Baba Yaga? I just like the way Baba Yaga sounds. All right. He gets all nervous and anxious, but he likes me, but he just kind of wants to hang around me until he gets tired, and then he's a crybaby. So Pete Hegseth says he always looks at the court's decisions, but he doesn't give a shit at federal courts. When it comes to foreign policy and national security, the district court, the appeals court, the Supreme Court, bah goo. They don't know what the fuck is going on. The Marines are allowed to protect the federal property and the personnel, but they're not allowed to enforce California's. They cannot enforce California law. They can't enforce U.S. law. They're just there to protect federal property and personnel. The quote that I had heard was, the Marines can protect, but they don't participate. Unless the Insurrection Act is invoked. So the president has not invoked the Insurrection Act, but then Gavin Newsom hasn't invoked the Posse Comitatus either. The Posse Comitatus is when the sheriff goes around and recruits citizens to help enforce their law. But they can't recruit the military. So if the military starts doing domestic law enforcement, if the military starts to become our police, then they could go to jail for 2 years, theoretically, under the Posse Comitatus. So the Posse Comitatus is on Gavin Newsom's side. The Insurrection Act is on the president's side. And the president said that if there was an insurrection, he would use the Insurrection Act. And so, in some respects, by him not using the Insurrection Act, he's kind of pointing out that there's not a rebellion. If there was a rebellion, if there was an insurrection, he'd use the Insurrection Act. Is that correct? Of course that's correct. The people that are controlling the Marines and the California National Guard right now is Task Force 51. Task Force 51 controls the Marines and it controls the California National Guard. Task Force 51 protects. Task Force 51 is telling the Marines and the California National Guard to protect but not to participate. So they can protect the federal property, they can protect the federal personnel. What they can't do is enforce the immigration statutes. They can't enforce domestic law. They can't enforce really even American law. They could just protect the federal agents and the federal property. Brett Shumate is the Assistant U.S. Attorney General. Pam Bondi is the current U.S. Attorney General. This is case number 3:25-CV-04870-CRB. CRB is Charles Breyer. On the president's side, he had 6 attorneys total. Brett Shumate is the head attorney, but there's 5 other attorneys, and they wrote that appeal so damn quick. They wrote that appeal within hours. This is Newsom v. Trump 2025. So this is going to be a Supreme Court case. It'll be interesting to see how the Supreme Court justices come down on this. There are some interesting laws in the table. I had actually read the government's appeal, but I haven't read Newsom's, the Attorney General of California's, original complaint. And now, Table of Authorities, they quote a bunch of Table of Authorities. It's incredible that they wrote 31 pages, theoretically, in the span of a few hours. I have 4 cases right here that they had referenced. Marbury v. Madison, 1803. Luther v. Borden, 1849. In re Debs, 1895. And in re Neagle, 1890. Luther v. Borden, 1849, was used as justification for the U.S. occupation of the South. So during the Civil War, You had Lincoln and the United States of America, and they defeated the racist Confederate pieces of shit, and there was a military occupation in the South. And they pointed to Luther v. Borden, the 1849 case. Marbury v. Madison, of course, is judicial review. John Marshall establishes that the Supreme Court gets judicial review over the acts of Congress and the actions of the president. Henry Debs, this is Eugene Debs. Henry Debs, that was about the mail. That was about the strike, the Pullman strike. And then Henry Neagle, it has something to do with the mail. I'm not familiar with Henry Neagle as much, but it was one of the earlier cases, 1890. So Marbury v. Madison is 1803, Luther v. Borden is 1849, Henry Debs is 1895, and Henry Neagle is 1890. Now, I had read the appeal. I read the appeal that the president had put out, Brett Shumate. And I got some notes about the appeal that Brett Shumate had put out. There is no rioter's veto to enforcement of federal law. There is no rioter's veto to enforcement of federal law. So the people that want to enforce the federal law, you can't just have the mob doing a bunch of riots and then that doesn't give them a veto. But there is the thing that when dictatorship becomes fact, then revolution becomes duty. That's just logical. When dictatorship becomes a fact, then revolution becomes a duty. But I dream of an electoral revolution or a constitutional revolution. Talk to me January 1st, 2026. But that's where I stand today. So let's talk about the government appeal. So the government is pointing out the main law is Title 10 U.S. 12406. Title 10 U.S. 12406. And then there's only 3 short sections. Number 1, the president can federalize the National Guard to repel invasion. Number 2, to suppress rebellion. Or number 3, to execute the federal laws. Well, shit, that's just the same damn thing as Article 1. That's the same powers that Congress has. The posse comitatus is where the sheriff deputizes the citizens, or the county government goes around and deputizes the citizens because of some emergency, some rebellion, some invasion. The posse comitatus and the Insurrection Act are opposed to each other. The president is on the side of the Insurrection Act, and the state governors are on the side of posse comitatus. They use the word anathema. Anathema, I've seen this word come up several times. I do not like the word anathema. Anathema is the Pope's curse. Whenever the Pope excommunicates a person. So I wish they would stop using the word anathema. If anybody was like, you know what? My preferences are anathema against Disney because of Snow White. Why did they have that damn actress in Snow White? What the hell were they thinking? The history of not liking standing armies. America has a history of not liking standing armies. The whole point of the Second Amendment is what's necessary for the security of a free state? A well-regulated militia. And even though a National Guard is one form of a well-regulated militia, you know what another form is? The citizens organizing themselves. And so I'm the leader of the Rainbow Militia. The total membership of the Rainbow Militia is 1. And it's not even me. It's JoJo Beans. I was able to get JoJo Beans I recruited him to lead the Rainbow Militia. But I haven't joined yet. But a well-regulated militia could just be a citizen-based militia. It doesn't have to be the National Guard. But according to the president's case, the appeal, Brett Shumate, he says that the militia of old today is the National Guard. What they were talking about when they said the militia, that's the National Guard. The National Guard is the militia. Brett Shugate said in his appeal that the courts didn't interfere when Eisenhower had used the military against Americans, and the courts didn't interfere when Nixon used the military against Americans. Eisenhower used the military for desegregation, and Nixon used the military to deliver the mail during a postal strike. And I'm pretty sure it's Brett Shugate, right? I'm looking at this case right here. Brett Shumate, Brett A. Shumate, Eric J. Hamilton, Alexander K. Haas, Christopher Edelman, Gary D. Hartlieb, Benjamin S. Kurland. Those are the 6 lawyers for the president. So I'm just going to say the president's appeal. Federalist Paper 29, Federalist Paper 46 are 2 Federalist Papers that talks about the militia. Now, according to the president's appeal, which was upheld by the Ninth Circuit, the militia of old is the National Guard, and the National Guard has 2 sections. You got a federal National Guard and you got a state National Guard. I don't know if there's actually particularly a federal National Guard until they federalize it, but there could be, maybe in DC or some shit. But most of the time, people are with the state National Guard and they work for the state, they are the state, and they are always the state. Unless the damn president or Congress intervenes. Donald Trump has not invoked the Insurrection Act. The first Militia Act was enacted in first Act of 1792 was utilized by George Washington during the Whiskey Rebellion. So the president did not invoke the Insurrection Act, and Gavin Newsom did not invoke the Posse Comitatus Act. If Gavin Newsom had invoked the Posse Comitatus and the president had invoked the Insurrection Act, that would be a fucking civil war. Is it possible that the president could use the military, the Marines, the Army, the Navy for his own personal ambition? Yeah, that's possible. The president could use the military to go around killing communists or rounding them up and arresting communists, liberals, anarchists, anti-fascist, trade unionist. What's that poem say? First they came for the communists, then the trade unionists, then the Jews, and then nobody was left to stand up for me. So the trade unionist, the communist, and the Jews. A standing army could be used to arrest those people. A standing army, the president could also use the military to make sure that he has a 3rd term. The president could also use the military to start a war with Canada or some other country in order to stay in power. So specifically Title 10, U.S. 12,406, they said that the orders have to go through the governor. So the president can call the National Guard into service, but the orders have to go through the governor. And so they're talking about both of them essentially governing the National Guard. The president's the commander-in-chief, but then the governor's the commander-in-chief. The president can call the National Guard into service. Hey, National Guard, can you come into service? But the National Guard follows the orders of the governor. So that means the president would write a bunch of recommendations. That's what the president should have done with Gavin Newsom. If President Trump would have just said, hey, Gavin Newsom, we got all those chaos in L.A. Do you think you could deploy some of the National Guard down there so we can take care of this chaos? Instead, I bet you what the president did is called up Gavin Newsom and said, hey, Gavin Newsom, you need to deploy the National Guard, you son of a bitch. You're a fucking nobody. You're my subordinate, you pile of shit. And then when Gavin Newsom was like, go fuck yourself, then they filed all these damn lawsuits. If only an authoritarian could learn how to finesse their orders. The Posse Comitatus Act is when the county government or the sheriff recruits the Marines, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, or the Space Force in order to enforce the law, to fight the rebellion, the invasion. The Posse Comitatus Act says that if the president uses the Marines to enforce domestic law, if the president uses the Marines to go around arresting Americans, then the president can go to jail for 2 years, and so could those Marines. If the president uses the Marines or the National Guard to go around arresting people for jaywalking and not wearing their seatbelt and just general yelling too loudly, the president's appeal used Black's Law Dictionary. So I don't know how good of a law dictionary this is, Black's Law Dictionary. The National Guard is one form of a trained citizenry when it comes to being a militia, but it's not the only form. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 talks about how Congress controls the militia, i.e. the National Guard. So even though the president is sitting there taking all the heat and taking all the blame and he's sitting there ordering people, Congress has the power when it comes to the National Guard. Congress has the power. Liberals say only the militia can have guns. When it comes to the Second Amendment, they want to say that individuals don't have a right to own guns for self-defense, that it has to be the militia. A well-regulated militia is necessary for a free state. The president's appeal also used the phrase ultra vires. Ultra vires, which is a Latin term, and sometimes a really good Latin term can just basically, I think a whole case could just turn on a Latin term. Ultra vires is acting or done beyond one's legal power or authority, beyond one's legal power or authority. He will take action against anybody acting ultra vires. At one point, they argue that the legislation is ultra vires, acting or done beyond one's legal power or authority. So extrajudicial, right? And that's the same thing. Or criminal. What's extrajudicial? Extrajudicial, que se hace o trata fuera de la via judicial. An extrajudicial killing is the deliberate killing of a person without the lawful authority granted by a judicial proceeding. Extrajudicial, not forming a valid part of regular legal proceedings, an extrajudicial investigation delivered without legal authority or private. So, kind of extrajudicial, ultra vires is extrajudicial. They also had referenced Martin v. Mott, 1827. This is when Madison called out the militia. And it's also a court decision that says that when the president calls out the militia, that's beyond judicial scrutiny. When the president calls out the militia, that is just beyond judicial scrutiny. James Madison had called out the National Guard for the War of 1812, which was, of course, when the British had burnt down our White House. It's also when Madison killed Tecumseh. The British burnt down our White House. They burnt down all of D.C., the archives, Congress, Capitol building, bunch of shit. But it's also when Francis Scott Key had wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. So, what do I think about all this? I'll only give you a couple thoughts. I don't like fascist, authoritarian, totalitarian piles of shit. I don't like that. I think that violence is the final option, and you should exhaust all options before you get to the final option. But an authoritarian, totalitarian, violent piece of shit, they choose violence as the first option. So I don't like the presidential overreach. The president has deported over 10 American kids. The president has deported over 10 American kids, many of them who have cancer. Why the fuck would we deport American kids who have cancer? They have cancer. They don't have medication. They don't have hospitals. Now they're living in fucking Honduras. Now they're living in goddamn Mexico. Are they going to get their medication, or are they going to get their hospital bed? And they were born here. Why has the president deported over 10 American kids? Several of them with cancer. Why would he do something like that? The president also said he didn't want to uphold the U.S. Constitution. ABC had fired Terry Moran. When it came to Nome v. Garcia, the Supreme Court had ruled against him 9-0, and he was acting like he wasn't going to comply with it. He was showing nothing but contempt for the Supreme Court. That's extrajudicial. That's extrajudicial. And then that Latin term, ultra vires. Oh, they also mentioned Rule 65 in civil court. Rule 65 in civil court, or in civil procedure. Because you know what Rule 65 in civil procedure means? So Gavin Newsom had actually demonstrated a very good case. Gavin Newsom had said that even though the National Guard purportedly was there to calm the violence down, the more National Guard that was poured into LA, the more protesters increased. So even though the idea was to pour in more troops and military, Marines, and National Guard in order to quash the protest, when the thing had begun, there was about 250 protesters, but after Trump got involved and started federalizing the National Guard and got 2,000, 4,000 more National Guard into LA, the protesters' numbers went from 250 to 3,000. So before Trump got involved, there was only 250 protesters, but as soon as they sent in more troops, the protesters became 3,000. So there's kind of a reverse blowback effect there. You're sending in the troops to calm the situation down, but by sending in the troops, it's pissing people off, saying, well, shit, this is fucking civil war. What are we doing here? Donald Trump had also threatened to arrest Gavin Newsom. I mean, how's that going to fucking help anybody? Well, I'll arrest you. He's the fucking king of fucking California. It's like he doesn't understand what his powers as president is. His powers of president is that he is the ruler of the 50 states. He's the ruler of the federal government. The federal government has specific enumerated powers. But by ruling 50 states, let's assume if Donald Trump was smart and he wanted to be a dictator, he would get the Congress on his side. He would get the Supreme Court on his side. He would get the state governors on his side. And that would almost be enough if he was being a smart dictator. Now, if he's a dumb dictator, then he just will say, hey, everybody do what the fuck I say and fuck all the rest of you all. So, the president had threatened to arrest the governor. Are you fucking nuts? So the governor should have just turned back around and said, I'll arrest you. You want to arrest me? I'll arrest you first. If you took a look at what happened to Alex Padilla, whoever arrests the other person first is who, basically, the other person is the fucking criminal. If you arrested that person is the criminal. So the president could have done a lot better job if the president would have finessed the National Guard deployment instead of ordering Gavin Newsom to do as he says. Do as you're told, boy. If Donald Trump would have said, hey, here's some recommendations. Even Abraham Lincoln had wrote like a recommendation to fucking, what's his name? Not U.S. Grant, but the other guy that he ran against later on, his first general, McClellan. Abraham Lincoln wrote him a letter saying, you know, if you don't want to use the U.S. Army, I'd like to borrow it. I'd like to borrow the U.S. Army if you're not going to use it. And so he was encouraging him to use it. So Trump could have just said, here's 4 recommendations that you could do with the National Guard. I would like for you to deploy the National Guard. Let's work together so we can quell this problem that's going on in LA. But instead, he treated Newsom like a goddamn subordinate. That's what the fuck he did.